It was late afternoon on September 14, 1982. Lebanon's new president-elect Bashir Gemayel is addressing members of his party, the Christian Kataib, also known as the Phalange. At 4:10 p.m., an enormous bomb exploded at the party headquarters, killing 27 people, including Gemayel. His death, which occurred during a civil war in the country, would be the catalyst for a major atrocity. Back in June, the Israeli military had launched an unprecedented invasion of Lebanon and came to occupy much of the country. In Beirut, they laid siege to the city. By the end of the first week in July, 500 buildings had been destroyed by shells and bombs. Following the siege and massive bombing, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz sent veteran diplomat Philip Habib to negotiate an end to the fighting. Yasser Arafat, leader of the PLO, agreed to withdraw all of his troops from Lebanon. Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon was furious. Sharon, impatient with what he regarded as American meddling, ordered unprecedented saturation bombing of Beirut, in which at least 300 people were killed. Regardless, the PLO left Lebanon. PLO fighters were evacuated by sea for Tunisia, and Arafat himself left on October 30th. According to Morris Draper, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, this evacuation was successful, and told Sharon as much in a meeting, the minutes of which being released in 2012 by the New York Times. "We did our best to get as many out as possible, and our concern that there would be some third echelon leaders left behind turned out not to be the case." He called it reasonably successful. In fact, we were overjoyed that we got up to the 15,000 mark when 13,000 was the target. Morris was responding to Sharon's insistence that there were 2,000 so-called terrorists in West Beirut. The Israelis had long found an ally in the Christian Lebanese forces, and following the PLO evacuation, elections were held in Lebanon, in accordance with an Israeli plan to form a Christian-led government. Bashir Gemayel, leader of the Maronite Phalange Party, was elected president. A telegram from Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to the president-elect read, "May God be with you, dear friend, in the fulfillment of your greatest work mission." Gemayel, along with being a sworn enemy of the Palestinians, openly called for the withdrawal of all foreign armies from Lebanon, Israelis, Palestinians, and Syrians. The Syrians, in the midst of an eternal war with Lebanon over ambitions for a greater Syria, were not pleased with this prospect. With Gemayel's assassination, the entire Israeli plan for Lebanon was foiled. Enraged, Defense Minister Ariel Sharon ordered the IDF commanders to allow the Phalangist militia to enter the Palestinian refugee camps at Sabra and Shatila. In the Israeli documents released by the New York Times in 2012, Ariel Sharon speaks of the planned mopping up operations. "The situation is that there are parts or quarters of the town which are kept by the terrorists, so the Lebanese army will go in. Why should we do it? The Lebanese army will go in. We can point out all the places and parts of the town where they can act. We are not going to create any barrier between the terrorists and themselves. As a matter of fact, at the present time, they can act freely in Shatila. They can act in Sabra. They could just start their attack immediately. And I would say, the earlier they start, the better. They will clean everything." The IDF promptly moved into West Beirut, and the Phalange, who previously would not lift a finger to help the IDF, now seemed very anxious to participate and entrusted the task of clearing the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila to the elite units of the Lebanese forces under the notoriously ruthless Eliyahu Beka. Rather than withdrawing, as the U.S. wanted them to, the IDF completely surrounded the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, setting up checkpoints to control all entrance and exit. On September 16th, the IDF ushered in the Phalange, and for 40 straight hours, the revenge-thirsty militants immediately began their massacre, where they killed and dismembered at least 800 civilians, while Israeli flares illuminated the camp's narrow and darkened alleyways. Nearly all of the dead were women, children, and elderly men. Bayan Wayedhut would author a comprehensive and conservative study of the massacre, aggregating names from about 20 different lists. The total number of 1,300 named victims, high as this seemed when the subtotals from the various lists were aggregated, remains an understatement of the real number of victims. Following the slaughter, Secretary of State George Shultz would phone Moshe Ahrens, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, telling him the president is deeply upset. What we have here is a massacre. Women and children were murdered. Defenseless people were killed. Mass graves. It's a horrible picture. We find it very hard to accept that this would take place if you had really asserted yourself in those camps. As you know, when you and I talked, we urged you not to go in. This is the first time Israel has gone into an Arab capital, and there will be implications and fallout for the long run. In the months after the massacre, Israel continued to sink deeper and deeper into the Lebanese quagmire. Following the massacre, U.S. Marines were redeployed to Lebanon, along with European allies and a United Nations interim peacekeeping force. Lebanon became crowded with foreign forces. Israel had succeeded in what it came to Lebanon for, to banish the PLO. To do so, they killed 15,000 to 20,000 people. However, as George Shultz had warned, this would indeed come with a number of serious consequences. As then Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin said after the war in a speech in New York, Shiite terrorism carries with it a much greater danger than PLO terrorism. If, as a result of the war in Lebanon, we will have succeeded in eliminating to a large extent the PLO terrorists, but we will have brought about Shiite terrorism, one would have to think twice about what really proved to be the results of this war. The U.S. Marines, in the words of Rashid Khalidi, had returned to an ill-defined mission in the city soon after the Sabra and Shatila massacres. For the United States, its insistence on monopolizing Middle East diplomacy and its furtherance of Israel's ambitions did not serve American interests well. This was glaringly attested to by subsequent events. In many ways, the war in Lebanon is a model for the current war on Gaza, more than 40 years later, and like how lies and disinformation helped spur a devastating conflict then, sadly, very little has changed. Luckily now, we have much better resources to combat this problem. That's why I use Ground News. When researching for my videos, Ground News provides all the articles on a topic in one place and shows additional context on where this news is coming from, so I can compare coverage and see the full story. For instance, I saw this story. 3 Israeli hostages killed by IDF were holding white flag. Here we can see that there have been over 200 articles published and that the news is covered evenly by the left, the center, and the right. Beside every headline, there's a tag that shows the political leaning, reliability, and ownership of the outlet. However, looking closer at the headlines, we can see very different stories being presented. Articles on the left are focused on the increasing number of journalists and hostage deaths, while articles on the right are highlighting Israel's commitment to the war. I think what Ground News is doing is really important, and I encourage you to check it out. Go to ground.news/GDF, subscribe through my link for less than $1 a month, or take advantage of their special holiday discount, 40% off of their Vantage plan for unlimited access, which is what I have. Get access to data-driven information and support my channel in the meantime. Though it may surprise you, many Shias living in South Lebanon initially welcomed the Israelis. For years, they had lived under an unfair system that privileged Sunni Muslims and Christians. Shias were neglected, poor, and disenfranchised. But, as the Christian Science Monitor observed as early as August of 1982, as the Israeli army lingers in South Lebanon with no early departure in view, the welcome originally extended by many residents is cooling down. Thomas Friedman, in his famous From Beirut to Jerusalem, gave valuable insight into this degradation. If there was any single incident that turned the Lebanese Shiites from potential Israeli allies to implacable foes, it was a little reported fracas which occurred on October 16, 1983, in the South Lebanon market town of Nabatia. Friedman writes that around 50,000 people were gathered in the city's center to celebrate Ashura, which commemorates the martyrdom of Hussein, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. In the middle of the Ashura services, an Israeli military convoy tried to drive through Nabatia honking horns for people to get out of the way. The Shiites saw the Israeli intrusion as a crude violation of their sacred moment, and they immediately began pelting the Israeli convoy with stones and bottles, even overturning some of the vehicles. The Israelis responded by shooting them, killing at least 2 and injuring 15. Before the Ashura incident, attacks against Israelis were sporadic and confined largely to tiny splinter factions. In the wake of the Nabatea incident, Friedman says, Shia groups began competing with other Shiite militias to see who could take out the most Israeli casualties. The Israeli military responded with draconian security measures. Checkpoints, travel restrictions, searches, seizures, which only enraged the population even more. The Shiites attacked the Israeli troops anyway and anywhere they could, with hit-and-run ambushes, nail bombs, suicide cars, roadside bombs, and snipers. April 18, 1983. A dented, late-model GMC pickup truck, sitting low on its springs, swerved through lunchtime traffic before the driver pushed the gas pedal against the floor. The truck heading directly for U.S. Embassy Beirut. By the time it entered the driveway, the truck was moving too fast for the guards to draw their weapons. After driving down a short flight of stairs, it smashed through the doors of the lobby. The time was 1:03 p.m. At ground zero, the center of the 7-story embassy lifted up hundreds of feet into the air, remained suspended for what seemed an eternity, and then collapsed in a cloud of dust. The lobby itself was blasted into powder. The thick plexiglass window protecting Guard Post 1 imploded at about 27,000 feet per second, disintegrating the young Marine on duty. The only part of him found was the melted brass buttons of his tunic. The massive bomb, containing 2,000 pounds of explosives, killed 63 people. It was the deadliest terror attack on the United States up to that point, and the single deadliest day in the CIA's history. 8 officers were killed, including the chief of station, the deputy chief of station, and National Intelligence Officer for the Near East, Bob Ames, whose hand was found floating a mile offshore. The wedding ring still on his finger. The group which claimed responsibility for the attack would call themselves Islamic Jihad, a shadowy group. This was an ultra-radical breakaway faction of the Shiite Amal movement that would soon become known as Hezbollah. The birthplace of this effective and remorseless new organization was Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. During the war, the new Islamic Republic of Iran deployed some 1,500 members of its Revolutionary Guard Corps to this agricultural eastern flank of the country. There, the IRGC trained recruits from the Shia population. Among the most prominent volunteers were a pair of young Shiite clerics, 34-year-old Subid Tufaili and 30-year-old Abbas Musawi, both educated in the seminaries of Najaf, Iraq, where Ayatollah Khomeini had lived in exile until 1978. They would become Hezbollah's first 2 secretaries general. More importantly, though, was the ascent of Hezbollah's director of military operations, Imad Mughnia. Mughnia was born in South Lebanon and raised in the Beirut slums. In 1982, he was only 20 years old and had already fought for the PLO in their Elite 417, though after the PLO were expelled from Lebanon, he joined Hezbollah. For the next 20 years, he would oversee virtually all of Hezbollah's military operations, from bombings to kidnappings. Major David Barkai, who commanded the Northern Unit 504 military intelligence base, was, in the words of Israeli journalist Ronan Bergman, in charge of the Mughnia file. He said of him, "His is one of the most creative and brilliant minds I have ever come across. He is a man with deep understanding, an excellent technical grasp and leadership ability. Unfortunately, a mixture of personal and geopolitical circumstances led him to channel his outstanding talents into the path of blood and destruction, and to make him into such a dangerous enemy." U.S. Marines would see him directing attacks on their positions, but they did not know his name. They called him Castro because of his beard. Hezbollah would not even reveal his existence until his death in 2008. This was symptomatic of the secretiveness that surrounded the entire organization. It would not officially admit its existence until the release of their 1985 manifesto. Their manifesto reads, in part, "We are often asked, who are we, the Hezbollah, and what is our identity? We are the sons of the Ummah, the party of God, the vanguard of which was made victorious by God in Iran. We obey the orders of one leader, wise and just, that of our tutor and faqih, who fulfills all the necessary conditions, Ruhollah Musawi Khomeini." In a section titled, "Our Fight," Hezbollah declares, "We combat abomination, and we shall tear out its very roots, its primary roots, which are the U.S." You may find it interesting as well what they make explicit mention of. In a single night, the Israelis and phalangists executed thousands of our sons, women, and children in Sabra and Shatila. No international organization protested or denounced this ferocious massacre in an effective manner, a massacre perpetrated with the tacit accord of America's European allies. How did the Shias in the South go from passive martyrdom into fully embracing jihad? I'd like to take a moment to talk about jihad. Jihad, with regard to Hezbollah's interpretation, takes two forms. The first is the least reported and by far the most common form of jihad, what's called greater jihad. Greater jihad refers to all manner of personal trials and tribulations, even the most mundane struggles of daily life, to fight against sin. This is a battle that can never truly be won, and therefore the struggle is waged for your entire life. Further, this greater jihad is the most important struggle. As Hezbollah Secretary General Sayed Nasrallah once put it, the battle with oneself is more dangerous than the battle with the external enemy. Thus, our struggle against ourselves must be stronger than our struggle with our enemy. The second form of jihad is what's called lesser jihad, the one that most non-Muslims appear to think of when they think of jihad, holy war. Lesser jihad encompasses the fight against the enemy. As Ahmed Nizar Hamza of the American University in Beirut describes, lesser jihad is justified in terms of Islam's intrinsic superiority and its obligation to spread its sway over the earth. However, Hezbollah believe that lesser jihad can only be authorized by the Prophet Muhammad himself, or the hidden Imam, who will emerge only at the end of time. Naim Qassem, Hezbollah's second-in-command, has articulated this. In the absence of the hidden Imam, the jurists cannot authorize the elementary jihad, and accordingly its conditions are not present. The Ayatollah Khomeini was perhaps one of the more important figures in the battle to authorize armed struggle against the occupiers of Lebanon. In fact, Khomeini agreed that defensive wars were not jihad, but difa, or defense. He also said that participation was mandatory. If the enemy invades the cities of Muslims and their borders, it is obligatory for all Muslims to defend those by any means possible, forsaking life and belongings. The debate over the justification for suicide bombing is fascinating in and of itself. The late Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, a famous theologian who became an advocate of the practice, once told the Daily Telegraph, "I was not the one who launched the idea of so-called suicide bombings, but I have certainly argued in favor of them. During the Second World War, how many civilians did the West kill? Were the bombs which fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki dropped on civilians or not? In your war against the Nazis, were you willing to use any means? Of course you were." As U.S. Army Captain Daniel Helmer wrote in Military Review in 2006, Westerners, at least initially, viewed suicide bombing as pointless violence done in the name of Islam. They were mistaken. Hezbollah thought deeply about the theological implications of the weapon, its capabilities and limitations, the political and military goals that it could help achieve, and its propaganda value. Hezbollah's favorite tactic was far from being illogical. In fact, given the political situation and the culture, it was quite rational and perhaps even moral. In the rubble of the American embassy in Beirut lay the residue of a bomb, used by a Muslim group to attack the United States, perhaps for the first time. The Americans would move their operations to a building in the east of the city. For now, the American mission continued. Still, the terror and violence continued. On the morning of October 23, 1983, Colonel Tim Garrity was sitting in his office when shards of glass from blown-out windows, equipment, manuals, and papers flew across my office. After collecting himself, Garrity walked outside, looking toward a Marine barracks building housing hundreds of U.S. Marines. But where it stood, he saw nothing. Standing next to Garrity was Major Bob Melton, who cried out, "My God, the BLT building is gone." Just minutes before, a 19-ton Mercedes-Benz stick-bed truck was racing on an access road toward the building, which housed the 1st Battalion 8th Marines. The driver turned to circle the building, then accelerated, plowing through a barbed wire fence and a wall of sandbags, then right into the main entrance of the battalion headquarters. The subsequent blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, the equivalent of 12,000 pounds of TNT. The explosion was so enormous, it pulled the entire building out of its foundation, suspended the building in the air, where it then collapsed onto itself. 241 Marines in all were killed. For the U.S. Marine Corps, the deadliest day since the Battle of Iwo Jima. Garrity would later describe the scene. Mangled, dismembered corpses were strewn throughout the area in a grotesque fashion. One Marine's body, still within his sleeping bag, was impaled on a tree limb. The explosive, an assembly of butane canisters and petant explosive, a white powder used in detonating wire, had been placed on a 7-inch floor of concrete covered with an inch-thick slab of solid marble to direct the intensity of the blast upward. Even so, the explosive force drove the truck bed 8 feet down into the earth. At almost exactly the same time as this bombing, a second suicide bomber driving a pickup truck raced toward a 9-story apartment building housing French paratroopers. That building was also destroyed, and 58 paratroopers were killed. The total death toll that day was now more than 300. These attacks were not simply the result of cruelty or bloodlust. They were part of a calculated strategy designed to drive Israel, the United States, and other Western influences out of Lebanon. That strategy worked. Less than 4 months after the attack, Reagan, quote, redeployed the Marines out of Lebanon. The United States never even bothered to retaliate. They wouldn't even join France and Israel for airstrikes in the Bekaa Valley. Even with the Marines gone, the Americans were still being targeted. On March 16, 1984, William Buckley was snatched off the streets of Beirut and disappeared. At first, he was described as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy, but in reality, he was the CIA station chief for Beirut, overseeing operations in all of Lebanon. At Langley, the agency reportedly spent a small fortune on informants and signal intelligence, just for the operation to fail. Buckley would be held for more than a year and killed, or executed, as his captors would describe it. As he died, there were 5 other Americans held hostage in the country. Over the following decade, the numbers kidnapped would balloon to 100. This would become a crisis for the Americans and another effective weapon used by Hezbollah. With the old building in ruins, the U.S. Embassy mission relocated to the east of the city. They would not catch a break. On September 20th, 1984, a bomb-laden van packed with 3,000 pounds of explosives sped toward the new embassy annex, which was so new it had not yet installed a planned steel gate on the perimeter. That explosion killed 23 and injured 90. Of course, it wasn't only the Americans, the abomination that Hezbollah loathed, but also the occupiers who remained after the U.S. withdrew. In fact, even before they left, the Israelis were not spared the fate of the car bomb. As early as 1982, a Chevrolet pickup carrying half a ton of explosives smashed through the barricade of a military base in Tyre. 75 would be killed. A year later, another pickup crashed into the IDF headquarters in Tyre in a building housing the Shin Bet headquarters, Shin Bet as in the Israeli FBI or MI5. This attack killed 28. The two separate tire bombings had claimed the lives of 103 Israelis. By the end of 1985, amid rising anger over the war, as well as rising casualties, Israel decided to redeploy its troops down to an area that would be called a safe zone. Hezbollah had successfully pushed out not only the multinational force, the US and the French, but also the Israelis from much of the area that they occupied. For the next 18 years of occupation in the south, Hezbollah engaged the Israelis in low-intensity combat in guerrilla warfare. Their weapon of choice, the roadside bomb. The Shiites displayed a relentlessness which the Israelis had never encountered from an Arab foe before. They weren't just ready to kill, they were ready to die. Much like Vietnam, South Lebanon became terrifying for Israeli soldiers, who grew to dread moving out of their base camps for fear that any object, rock, bush, or tree, might explode next to them. Finally, after the Israelis had themselves deemed the situation untenable, they pulled out completely in 2000, and with that, Hezbollah had now banished the Americans, the French, and now finally, the Israelis from Lebanon.